Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's live webinar, Offensive v Defensive Security, Cyber Stories from the Field. My name is Andrew Jenkins. I'm the Demand Generation Manager here at NetSPI, and as always, it's great to see so many of you are joining us for today's live webinar. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping rules. First of all, remember that this webinar is being recorded, so if you miss something, perhaps you have to head out early or have a brief interruption, no worries at all. You will still receive a recording of this webinar to catch up on anything that you may have missed. Secondly, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them. We will be having a Q&A session at the end of the webinar where our speakers, Nabil and JR, will be happy to answer any questions that you may have. If we don't have time to answer your question or if we don't get to it, please feel free to reach out to us and we would be happy to answer it. Lastly, if you'd like to learn more about NetSPI or Nuspire after the webinar, we have provided you with some additional resources in the resource tab. So please feel free to take a look at those resources and share them with your team. So with that said, I'm going to hand you over to Nabil and JR to get things started here.
Well, awesome. Nabil, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this. Really appreciate it. You guys are the best at what you do, and so the idea of doing this was a lot of fun, and it's just a pleasure to be able to do this webinar with you. And hopefully, the audience can get some good nuggets from the two of us curmudgeons who have been around the block and done this a few times.
Yeah, likewise, JR. And Andrew, thanks for the introduction. You know, as we talked about earlier, we've been running in the same circles for a really long time, but it's the first time we get to work together on this webinar and share our stories. So I'm excited.
Cool. For those of you that are just joining us, a lot of what really we want to talk about today is the difference between perspectives from an offensive and defensive side of pen testing. And so obviously, for myself being the leader of a security program for a managed security services provider, we spend a lot of time on defense. And Nabil, obviously, you've got a slightly different perspective. And so we thought it'd be great to come together and kind of share a little bit about just the whole world of pen testing and provide some war stories, if you will, that include both the defensive and the offensive side of things. So, with that, Nabil, I think, starting off really, we were going to talk a little bit about, pen testing and what it is and all of that. But we wanted to start off with this poll question. So, Andrew, I'll leave it to you to put up the poll here. Really about how often do we pen test, right? And a lot of different organizations, I know for my clients, a lot of them have different regulatory requirements. They have different program requirements. They have different attestations they need to do. And so I'm very curious to see the results of this one.
Yeah, while the numbers come in, I'm seeing a live view of the numbers coming in. It's actually quite interesting. But JR, before we even get too far into this, I think it would be unfair if we didn't do proper introductions on who we are and why people should listen to us. So I'll go first. I'm Nabil Hannan. I'm the field CISO at NetSPI. I've been in the cybersecurity space now for over 16 years, officially breaking things that people are paying me for. Before that, I've been breaking things since I was 7 and getting in trouble with my parents most of the time. JR, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah, thanks. So JR Cunningham, Chief Security Officer here at Nuspire. I've been in the business for over 2 decades. I had hair when I started, and really most of my career has been focused around consulting and building great consulting organizations and great security programs for my clients. So much of what I've been doing for the last 2 decades has really been about in the internal aspects of a security program at a company, building security programs and making sure that they have the right business aligned and risk aware controls for the business. So what Nabil has been doing for his career has obviously been a major part of what's made me successful in being able to understand our controls that I recommend for clients working or not, are the things that we've implemented working or not. So as we mentioned earlier, a lot of fun to do this together. All right. Poll questions. Are we getting any more answers here?
I think we're at a standstill on answers, but as you can see clearly, the majority of them seem to be once a year. And if I had to take a guess, I would guess it's probably because of the fact that there are regulatory requirements that require you to test a certain number of times. Not surprising, to be honest with you. Or there are actually a lot of customer contracts that I run into where people have a requirement to show their customers a test that was done within the last year or so. And that tends to be the most common one I see. JR, what about you from your perspective? I mean, what are you typically seeing on your side?
Yeah, I agree with you. Most of the pen testing requirements that we run into are driven by regulatory requirements to say that at least once a year, organizations are going to have a look. I will say that the more cloud-centric and the more app-centric an organization is, the more often it seems like they want to at least do partial pen testing to see if new releases are vulnerable, et cetera. I was really happy to see one respondent replied with continuous. This is relatively new in our space. You folks at NetSPI have been out on the forefront of pen testing as a service and continuous pen testing. And obviously, I think you and I would agree that that's the future of penetration testing. Instead of taking a point-in-time picture, doing a more real time or near real time pen test is going to be kind of the bad guys are doing this, right? So glad to see that folks are kind of starting to move in that direction, and I think that's where this goes from here.
I think the caveat there is it's really hard to do continuous or truly continuous testing, especially if you have systems that are going through regular changes and updates. The fact that pen testing takes a little bit of time, especially if you're not doing everything automated, pen testing implies that you have a human component of people testing things to find problems with systems. Getting through a pen test is a challenge for a lot of people because there's that extra time involved in preparing and getting an environment ready for testing, getting results back from the pen test, etc. So we've been trying really hard to make that gap as small and transparent as possible. So with our pen testing as a service offering, we're seeing more and more adoption because customers like the fact that they don't have to wait for a PDF report to understand what issues they have. During the test, they can see what vulnerabilities are being reported in near real time, and they can start addressing them even before a test is completed. So that's something that we're heavily investing in, and a lot of our customers are getting a lot of value out of.
I thought this was an interesting stat from Cisco's Cybersecurity Readiness Index. They talked about 60% of organizations that were part of this readiness index had an incident in the last 12 months, and costs were around $500,000 on average for about half of those involved. To me, this speaks to bad things happen, even though most of these organizations that were surveyed by Cisco had security programs in place. They had a framework that they were using to run their security program. They were attempting to do the right things, and yet bad stuff still happened. And so, I think for me, when we're talking to clients and we're building parts of their security program or managing parts of their security program, we always are kind of having that mindset of, we need to test this to make sure it's working properly for you. In theory, having all kinds of controls in place, either technical or process controls, are going to mitigate a lot of this risk, but we need to know, what does it look like from the bad guy perspective? And are these controls actually working as designed? Are we maintaining the controls properly? I think you and I both seen the scenario where we go out, we spend a whole bunch of money, we deploy a particular piece of technology or a new policy or standard, and then 6 months later, there's some turnover or whatever it may be, and now that system isn't working as designed, and then we start to inject vulnerability into the environment, and then we have a scenario where now we're being asked, hey, I invested in this technology. Why didn't it work for me? Why did the bad guys still get in? Real key driver for pen testing here for us anyway at Nuspire.
I think this also goes to highlight the fact that there's no such thing as being 100% secure. There's
right.
If you have an adversary that has the right means, time, funding, technology, resources to breach or cause a compromise for you, they probably can get there given enough of an effort being added there. The other piece that I think is interesting, often people tend to focus on doing activities that they're more comfortable with or they have a better understanding for. So they end up spending more and more and more of their budget doing that one thing without thinking holistically. And this is where you have the basics that get missed. And I think we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. But often you see if a security leader understands code review very well, but doesn't understand pen testing, when they double their budget, they double their code review practice, but they're still finding gaps in other places. Or they're, really strong on the network side and they keep investing in more and more network security controls, but they're not investing in the app security controls or app security investments. And we often see people do that and fall into that issue where they go, hey, I doubled my budget, I spent more money doing more of the same thing, why did I get breached? And they don't realize quickly the logical fallacy that they fall into, which is just because you're spending more money and doing the same thing more and more intensely or more frequently doesn't necessarily make you more secure.
We certainly see that with our clients who maybe historically have had a security team that's very infrastructure centric, and that business maybe has moved to be more application centric. And the security and IT teams might not be their native language. They might not be application engineers and developers and coders. And so they do exactly as you described. They kind of double down on, the infrastructure pen testing. And then, their business has changed and their application environment has changed, which leads to this, right? We forget about the basics of, what are the fundamental risks to the business? And, am I deploying security controls in a way that actually represent, how the bad guys are going to try and get me? And so we see a lot of clients come to us and say, hey, my business changed. I haven't really changed my security program, and bad things are starting to happen to me. Can you help me with my security program and why that is? And often it really is a simple back to basics. We've got to look at the entire risk spectrum and ask the question, what are we doing to defend against the attacks that are most likely to impact us?
And then this goes on to highlight the piece that people often find challenging when it comes to securing systems is often a person can compromise an organization who doesn't necessarily have a technical background or technical expertise. And that goes to the fact that ultimately the humans are probably your weakest link, but they're also the ones that can cause the most damage. And humans, you don't have the ability to automate controls around humans. And we'll talk about some examples later around social engineering attacks and how that had a pretty big impact. But I actually wanted to share a different story which just came to mind. This was a mother of a pen tester, actually a mother of a social engineering testing company. One of the consultants wanted to actually go and learn what her son does for a living. And it's a well-known article that's published that I read on this experience. So they wanted to go and red team and social engineer a prison. That was what they were hired to do. And he actually said, hey, mom, if you want to go, why don't we send you in? All you have to do is go plug in this device at an open power outlet somewhere. But you can go in and pretend to be like a health inspector that's there to help. And they share this funny experience where for a while the mom went offline. So they lost all communication channels with his mom while she was in this prison. And externally, they were panicking because they didn't understand what was going on. But what was actually happening was the warden or whoever the most senior person was they were working with, they pulled her aside so that they could ask for more advice on what else they could be doing from a health perspective to be better. And she had to go into their office and she gave them some more tips and whatnot. But she had no experience, no pen testing background, no social engineering background. She just went with the flow, and just goes to show you how it does not really take a skilled adversary. Often in movies misrepresent, how hacking happens. You see Hugh Jackman on 12 screens trying to write some worm that looks like cubes coming together. That's not really how it works. Oftentimes it's a lot more simple and rudimentary when it comes to these attacks.
You've got some great stories here and a couple of them you and I kind of zeroed in on. Can you talk a little bit about these types of pen testing? And I think, often I see this certainly with my clients. There's confusion about what are the different types of testing that are even available, and what should I be doing? Back to the poll, if I'm going to do a pen test once a year or once every 6 months, what are these different tests, and what should I be thinking about?
Yeah, and I want to caveat this with the fact that a lot of these types of pen tests bleed into each other. So there can be combinations of testing that happens across each of these domains. But the types of testing that we tend to do the most often are application tests. Applications are everywhere. If you think about your mobile phone or mobile device, I get frustrated with my mobile phone because I have to download like 100+ applications, it seems, to even do regular things. Every time I get a new phone or reinstall the operating system, it's the most frustrating thing for me. But as you can imagine, everything has an app. Everything you do today has an app. Whatever you can think about, whether it be web application, mobile application, thick clients, and so on. So application pen testing is a pretty key component of a lot of businesses and how they function. Network testing is another piece. I feel like an extension of network testing is the cloud testing piece, but ultimately, if you think of your overall underlying infrastructure that supports your business and your applications and things that you're hosting, that's where the network testing comes into play. Cloud adoption, as you can imagine, has become more prevalent. Everyone is deploying software systems into the cloud, building cloud native solutions to be able to scale. I feel like the pandemic helped accelerate a lot of the cloud adoption as well. So testing your cloud ecosystem, making sure everything is configured correctly, making sure systems are being deployed securely becomes critical. There's a social engineering and red teaming. Social engineering, I feel like, is a very focused area of red teaming. Red teaming is an objective-based assessment where you are trying to accomplish specific objectives with nothing else stopping you. So you're just given objectives and you have to figure out how you can accomplish that specific objective. Social engineering is a subset of that, where you're trying to socially get people to do things that give you certain types of advantage, whether it be access to systems, whether it be performing a certain action, and so on. And then the last one we have here is around IoT. It's a very broadly used term. The way I like to use it is anything that is connected to the internet, or anything that is connecting to something that is connected to the internet. So if you think of today, your thermostat has an internet connection. My refrigerator actually finally has an internet connection, which I never thought would be necessary, but it does. We have cameras, security cameras, alarms, sensors, and things around the home. A lot of these devices are getting connected to the internet today, and that's only adding more and more to the complexity of the ecosystem that supports everything that we do. Then the more complexity you add to something, the more chances you have for weaknesses and areas that can be compromised. So at a high level, we see these as being the higher level categories of things that we do testing on, and the types of pen testing that we see out there.
Your point about these things kind of melding together during the testing process, we certainly see that in the manufacturing and healthcare space, where the IoT side of things is as important as the traditional quote IT side of things, and organizations really need to understand the totality of their attack surface area and vulnerability in those areas. Do you find when you're positioning these tests or scheduling with clients, they want to do multiple tests at once, or do they tend to still go very serial in nature and start with infrastructure and application pen testing and then do cloud and then have you work on the social engineering? Or what's the normal flow of that for you all at NetSPI?
It's really hard, especially when it comes to systems like medical devices today, to do just one type of pen test, because you have to think of the ecosystem holistically and what is the solution providing to your end user. And if I can use a simple example, something I use a CPAP machine as an example. My CPAP machine has a mobile application that it communicates with. It can connect to it via Bluetooth, or it can actually connect to the backend service over a cell phone network, a GSM connection. It can also store and manage that data, and it's using a cloud-based service to store and manage and run the actual application backend, the mobile app backend, etc. And then, of course, I have the physical device itself that does everything. It even has an SD card to store data on, as an example. So when you have to test that whole ecosystem, it's very hard to say, okay, I want you to just test the mobile app, but not touch the cloud.
Right.
Because you can't really do it that way. Or it's hard to say, hey, look at the cloud, but I don't want you to think about how the connectivity is happening across different items like the phone and the device, because those all become part of the whole system that it's functioning as. So when we tend to scope out these engagements, it often becomes a combination of these types of tests that get factored into one scope, and then we come up with what the level of effort is.
So if you show up for work one day and you've had a bad night's sleep, we know that it was the annual pen test for the CPAP device. Nabil,
or just my
lifestyle,
or just my bad lifestyle. One of those two.
No, we got to blame it on security control failures, man. We can't rat ourselves out for lifestyle. You've got some great stories here. We talked about a few of them before the webinar, and really wanted to share some of your stories from in the field and things that you and the NetSPI team have done. We could do an entire day on some of these great stories. So for everybody that's watching, if you ever have any time to hang out with Nabil, take the opportunity. He's got great stories. He certainly will give you cause to stay up at night and worry about the state of cybersecurity in our world. But talk to me about this one. This is a great story.
Yeah, this one, it's a fantastic example of how the most secure places can be breached with some of the most simple techniques. And we're going to talk about a highly secure data center that we went and did an on-site assessment against. Now, to set some background and context, it wasn't like we were able to just show up and talk our way through into getting somewhere. It required a lot of preparation, research, and work that went into it, which made the actual day of the engagement a lot smoother. So it started with us looking at the data center and understanding by looking at their approved vendor list to see who they were using for pest control, which was a national brand of pest control company. So we then had to go and start emailing them, pretending to be from that company, to schedule an appointment that we were going to be on site to look at the status of their pest control needs and what type of service they might need in the future. Sort of a regular check-in and a visit, an audit of their facility. We also then had to go and create fake t-shirts that had this particular vendor's logo on it. And we also had to go get rent a van that looked like one of the vans they might be using. And we also had a fake logo made that got put on the van itself. And then when we showed up on site, A, we knew who to go ask for, and B, they were expecting us. So immediately we were let in. They scanned their badge, they did their retina scans, and just walked us through the front door. So you would think about a highly secure facility where you're paying a lot of money and trusting them to keep your data and software secure, but breaching them took just some preparation, some social engineering work, and we were in. Now, once we were in, it was fun because they actually gave our team a tour of the facility, and we were even able to get access to the ceiling where they had extra wiring and other ports that were open because we wanted to make sure they weren't being infested by pests. So they actually gave us access, freely walked us through. At times, they even left us alone so we could do our thing, and they could go do their thing. So we were allowed to walk around the floor of the data center and look at what controls they had. And then when we were finished, we were pushing the boundaries a little bit, but we wanted to see how far we could get from a technical access perspective. So the team went and told our main contact that they forgot to print the invoice for what they needed to send to them. And immediately the point of contact was very helpful. They gave us network access so we could get online. They allowed us to plug our computers in, and we were actually able to email them a fake PDF as part of the invoicing process. And then we left undetected. No one knew anything happened, anything went wrong, and we were on our way. And this goes to show you, why having a very close relationship with your physical security team is equally important as other technical controls you put into an environment, because people are still your weakest link. And if you don't train them, don't build a culture where they question certain things and they're diligent about what they're doing, it's very easy to breach highly secure facilities as well.
You mentioned right up front all these security controls that they had. You mentioned biometric retina scanner in this instance, and badge access and all that. And it's amazing with all of that money. Back to that second slide we had up, all that money spent on technical security controls, and the standards and procedures end up being the weak link. Slightly different one. What about the SQL injection and a little bit extra?
So the SQL injection one is one of my favorite tests that I've conducted, and found unauthenticated SQL injection through the login form of a web application. And the interesting thing about it is, when you start a pen test, you often have to decide, and looking at the system you're testing, especially for a web application, what functionality do I really want to test first? Because you want to prioritize and get the most bang for your buck up front. And I got really lucky, because the first set of credentials that the admin sent me didn't work. I tried to log into the test environment and it didn't let me log in. So I went back to his desk. This is when we were on site in an office. I went to his desk and I said, "Hey, look, you gave me this Post-it note with the password. This isn't working." And it happened to be my mistake. I actually fat-fingered the password, but I didn't know that at that point. He was just sitting next to me, walked up to him, and he goes, "No, that's not right. Let me show you." And he actually pulled up the console directly on the database, ran a query, show me the password where username equals this, and a password popped up. And he goes, "See, this is the password, the same thing that I typed up on here." And immediately in my head, I go, "Wait, does that mean you're not storing the password in a way where it's not reversible?" And he goes, No, we hash our passwords, so you can't reverse them." And I'm like, that makes no sense, because you just made a database query and showed me your password. So that can't be right. And he goes, No. I know how it's done. Don't worry. I have it. I saved it correctly, whatever. I didn't see his actual query, but I saw him do something very quickly. And I was like, okay, something's wrong. Something smells fishy. I'm going to investigate it further. Then I start logging in. I log in. It lets me in this time. And then I look for a very basic SQL injection attack, put in a single quote, see if it breaks anything. And, simple enough, it broke the authentication page. And then I finally managed to write up a query, and I was able to eventually pull out every username in the database, but I was getting back a digest. It looked like a hash that was being pulled up. Now, I paused for a second. I thought maybe he was right. Maybe he did hash everything. But then I looked through all the entries, and there was one entry where the length of the hash, or quote unquote hash, was double. And I go, okay, clearly these are not hashes, because the length cannot be different for one password versus all the other ones.
Right.
So after doing some more digging, looking through sys tables, trying to figure out what stored procedures are there, what other tables are there, etc., I found a stored procedure called a decrypt password. So I just had to update my query now, and where there was the digest, I said decrypt password, and I put that column name in, and I had unauthenticated clear text username and password for every user in their system within an hour and a half of testing the system. Goes to show you, hey, A, you're not storing your password correctly. B, you've built your own authentication mechanism that also failed you. And C, you know, it's not that hard to find and break some of these things. I did not have to do any crazy type of test cases. It was just the basic test cases that I learned when I started pen testing that just worked and got back clear text username and password for everybody.
You know, our CTO, Michael Wilson, has a quote that he uses often that kind of mirrors your key takeaway here. He says, friends don't let friends write authentication schemes. And certainly, you know, between that, and I think the other thing that we see is there's a gap often, especially when you talk about database administration and application administration. There's often a gap in the security team's understanding of how those systems actually work. And so they tend to take a hands-off approach. You know, that's the SQL team over there. They deal with, you know, with the databases, or that's the app dev team. They, you know, they do their thing. And then, you know, come to find out there are security specific things that maybe that team wasn't aware of, that a good security relationship, or as we like to say, deputization, where you have security stakeholders in those departments is really important.
There's more to this story that I didn't get to, which was they also had test code that was left behind for a security control. So it was the CAPTCHA. You know, we're all familiar with CAPTCHAs. This is how you prove that you're not a robot, right? It says, hey, you know, click here and I'm not a robot.
How many motorcycles are in the picture?
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
Or click and get rid of all the fire hydrants. Man, I hate those fire hydrant ones. They take way too long for no reason. Well, this one was a much simpler version, but once again, they implemented their own CAPTCHA solution, but they did it in a very poor way. They had, instead of coming up with CAPTCHAs on the fly and showing it to users, they had stored pictures of numbers that were malformed, and they had them in the database with the answers as well stored in the database. But to make it worse, when they served the CAPTCHA to the user, if you went into the HTML comments, they would also serve the answer in HTML comments that their Selenium automation was using for unit tests and regression testing. And they just forgot to remove it from production. So you could actually bypass any automation control like CAPTCHA because they had put the answer in the code that the client was receiving on their browser. Another example of don't roll your own security controls. Like there are ways this is done. There are known solutions. Go use those versus trying to build it from scratch.
You know, it's an interesting testament to, you know, really well-intentioned, well-meaning people doing things to try and improve their security posture, sometimes without fully understanding the ramifications of what it is they're doing. A great reason to have the experts test the environment, right, and draw out some of the answers to those questions. I wanted to share a little bit about pen testing from a client perspective. So, you know, we obviously we have a lot of clients where we manage the entirety of their cybersecurity program for them. And then obviously the consulting work that we do, we're often working with clients who either have had deficiencies or control failures, or they're asking us for how to get better over time. And, you know, really how to maximize the use of a pen test. One gotcha that I see more often than anything is when folks use pen test results to generate fear and panic in the organization, or they use it as a gotcha. You know, to use your database example with the SQL injection, you know, if you're a security practitioner and you're having a pen test done and you've been trying to make progress in database or application security, using that pen test result that, you know, Nabil just hands you a report and says, here you go, you've got this authentication problem with SQL. Using that as a club to get what you want out of the SQL database team is a bad plan, because, you know, what you end up having is more disconnect between security and the folks who are actually developing code on behalf of the business. And so where we've seen success here is, you know, really socializing a pen test as simply, I'm trying to look for failure of controls that I think exist. They might not exist. They might exist in a way that I don't think they're, you know, I think they're configured properly, but they're not. So I always try and socialize a pen test as we're not doing this to get anybody. We're not doing this to make anybody look bad or look like they don't know what they're doing from a cybersecurity perspective. We're doing this to test for control failure. Are the things that we think we have in place working as intended? That's not any different than an annual financial audit or any of the other type of audit activities organizations are used to. So that's kind of the first thing that we see with regarding fear and creating fear. And then the follow on to that is when organizations get their pen test report and they've got a whole bunch of stuff in red, the criticals and high level findings, and they pull the fire alarm and they create panic and launch new projects and all of this. A lot of these results can be distilled down to a very small set of either technical policy standard or procedures that an organization can do to improve all of their pen test results. And so we see a lot of organizations who they want to start at the top and look at the most critical things without kind of zooming out a little bit, looking at the whole pen test and answering the question, is there something wrong here with this a control or two that could wipe off a bunch of these particular vulnerabilities? So taking that kind of pragmatic approach to it, we find is really successful at avoiding fear and also avoiding the question of, well, I spent all this money on security. Why did you have all these findings and failures to begin with, right? It's usually a very small set of things. And Nabil, I know you and I could talk a whole nother webinar on the difference between a policy, a standard, a procedure, and then a technical control. But it sure seems to me like a lot of these results come down to there's just some policy that's translating into a standard that's translating into a procedure that can be fixed to mitigate a lot of the findings that you folks will have when you walk into an environment.
There's this concept of people thinking they have a standard when what they really have is policy, and I run into that everywhere. You will be surprised how often you go to an organization and go, okay, do you have coding standards, or can you show them to me? And they'll be like, yes, we do. They're usually very excited about it because it's something they probably built, and they're very eager to share and get feedback. But what they end up sharing with you is really policy. It's not quite standards. It's not quite as prescriptive. That's telling you, hey, it doesn't say, oh, you should do input validation. That's a policy. It's actually saying you should do input validation, and this is how. If you're coding in Java, use this. If you're coding in C++, do this. C#, do this. And that level of detail is often missing. Often people have things that say you should do input validation, you should do output encoding, you should do error handling, and so on. And it's very hard to differentiate that because people will often just call that document a standard when in reality it's a policy. And then you touched on this a little bit. I wanted to just emphasize it a little bit more. People often think of pen testing as a way to detect problems, whereas I think pen testing is a better way to detect gaps in other controls you had before versus being the first time you actually detect a problem. And if you take it that way, and if you can shift your perspective to think of pen testing as being a proactive control that helps you determine the effectiveness and efficacy of other controls that you have before getting to that pen test, it's usually much better received. And also, I understand that organizations that are maybe just starting to test and starting security efforts, maybe pen testing is the way for them to discover stuff, but you get a lot of return on your investment if you start thinking of it more proactively and start taking the learnings from the pen test and implementing controls ahead of time that make it easier and more preventable, prevention focused from a security vulnerability perspective.
It's a great point, and certainly looking at it as just a tool in a toolbox. I know at Nuspire we use it as a method to answer the question: are our controls working? But also, am I adjusting controls for different clients based on the risks to their business? And, do I have the right mix of controls in place? And those are fluid; they change because the enemy gets a vote here, and so they're the bad guy activity is always changing, and thankfully, companies like yours are staying current and on top of that. And so I find it refreshing to say, okay, last year I did something for my security program that maybe this year needs a tweak and a tune to it because the bad guy activity has changed, and you guys are bringing that to the table. I often get asked about fixing gaps, and how do we maximize improvements? And there are some obvious ones like retesting. I know when we work with you as a partner, we often have you come back and retest after we fix things that we think are really important to fix. But one of the questions I often get asked is, okay, I had a pen test. We found a critical or high level vulnerability. I fixed it. How do I ensure that doesn't come back? And this is really related to that last point, and that is, this is where good governance and fixing not just a technical vulnerability or a technical weakness, but looking deeper into the security program and asking a question: why did this happen? Did I have a policy failure? Did I have a training and awareness failure? To your point, Nabil, about standards, did I have a standard that I thought was effective enough, or did my environment change and now that standard is no longer relevant? I'm using a different development methodology, or I'm coding in a different language, or I've got new partners that are doing different work for me. And so we always like to take the view of, I've got this report, it's got all kinds of really good information in it about how the bad guys can get in. What can I do, not just from a plugging that hole, but what can I do with my security program to make sure that if that thing happens again, I have some warning that it's about to occur, or I can plug it quickly when it does occur. So that's kind of the first step, is not focusing necessarily only on the thing that was found, that critical or high, but also the governance aspect and the security program piece of it. And frankly, that's kind of a boring piece. That's not as fun as buying a new piece of technology or changing a firewall rule or patching a vulnerability. But often we find it's critically important in making sure that findings don't show up year after year after year, quarter after quarter after quarter.
I think we've seen an evolution there too, where in the past you found a problem and people bought a firewall, and then you found a different problem and people bought another firewall, and then you end up having 5 different firewalls that you're implementing all of a sudden in the matter of a few days. But I feel like we've moved away from that piece, where people understand that you can't just buy your way out of technical challenges and problems, and you have to implement a solution and get creative on how to do that effectively. But there are some basic things that still bother me as a practitioner, which is, why do we still have SQL injection and cross-site scripting showing up everywhere? We've known about this for decades. It's a common problem that's well understood. Everyone knows how to fix it. There's enough information online on how to fix it. And the way I think about it is, it's just like a disease, right? You find a disease, you find a cure or a vaccine, and you inoculate against it everywhere. Why haven't we been able to do that in the technology space for some of these most common vulnerabilities that are not that hard to understand and also not that hard to fix? And I feel like we're going more and more in the right direction with the adoption of, frameworks that have some security controls built in that protect you against certain vulnerabilities. Like, React is, adoption of React is helping reduce things like cross-site scripting, which is a nice side effect of the adoption of React. But some of these common vulnerabilities, I still don't understand why we haven't been able to eliminate them. And I feel like we need to really shift in our paradigm of software development to be able to come up with a solution that needs to be a little bit more holistic.
Nabil, I get asked all the time about really complex problems in our space. Like, I think I need a PKI infrastructure. I need to deploy NAC or DLP. And often I meet that with asking the question: do you have MFA turned on for all your apps, and do you have a vulnerability and patch management program in your environment? No. Okay. How about we start there and work on that stuff again, back to basics, and let's eliminate some of the low hanging fruit and make it really difficult for for the bad guys to require them to up their game, make us a harder target. And I think you're right. We're moving in the right direction there. I think part of what's helped here is default configurations are not what they once were. They tend to be a little more robust than they used to be. We don't see things showing up out of the box with really nasty vulnerabilities like we once did. Manufacturers are more invested. We've seen this with what has come out of the federal government, even with regards to having product manufacturers enforce better out-of-box security. I agree with you. It's really nice to see some of that stuff happening. Maybe we can get rid of some of these 20 and 25 and 30-year-old vulnerabilities and be able to focus on the cool stuff.
Well,
Which, by the way, I'm sure you
the,
folks want to do that stuff too. You want to do the fun stuff, right?
Yeah. The MFA stuff, MFA example still gets me because people will not implement MFA but want to do so many other things. And granted, I actually think we need to update how we authenticate to systems, because username, password, and then even MFA is a little outdated. I feel like we can get creative and come up with solutions. And there are solutions that are evolving to support better authentication and stronger authentication. But for the life of me, like when I got a new phone or lost a phone, or even one time I remember reinstalling the OS on my phone and I forgot that I had app-based multi-factor on that device for different services, and re-logging back into each of those services became so painful. It was like a separate activity I had to do over the course of a few hours. So I think MFA also needs to change a little bit.
I couldn't agree more. The only thing keeping me from ordering an iPhone 15 is my 3 authenticator apps, and the idea of going back and playing the QR code game for a day or two, for sure. All right. So we've got some resources up here. Andrew mentioned earlier. Take a peek here at questions and see what's come in.
Yeah. The resources will be shared with the group. Andrew will be sharing the slides and the content. So we'll have that. I think Andrew's going to come back on and share the questions for us. And I'm glad we had an audience member who agreed with our policy and standards discussion.
Yeah,
so
how about that?
Thank you. We're glad that we're aligned.
We did talk about this before as well, Lem. This is specifically for you, that at some point we want to do a talk track just on policy, standard, and procedure, because we think it would be worth the discussion. There's a lot of confusion out there on what these different mechanisms are.
Well, Nabil, JR, thank you both so much for your time and for presenting today. We do have some questions that have come through. So the first question goes back to the social engineering story. So love the social engineering story. How can we better prepare our employees to prevent a real attack like this? Is training and awareness enough?
So I want JR's perspective on this, but from my perspective, I think training and awareness is not enough. Training and awareness almost becomes a point in time activity, which honestly, I think people just do because their boss or manager gets harassed because they're read on some dashboard and they go, you have to go take your training refresher course or whatever. Most people, I think, click through and just go take the test at the end and move on. Security actually has to be a cultural shift, in my opinion, within an organization. And it goes beyond just training, awareness, and culture, but it also, a piece of it is happiness of the employees and the team that you have. Ultimately, even if someone, let's say, is trained and well aware that maybe they're getting phished, and they go, oh, wow, this looks like a phishing attack, and someone's asking for my password, they might be like, you know what, I hate this company, so who cares? Here's my password. I'm going to quit tomorrow anyways. That defeats the purpose of all the training, awareness, and culture of security too. So it goes beyond just training, awareness, culture. It goes around happiness of the company, the staff, health of the company, and the team members. All of those things get factored in. So it's beyond just the training and compliance piece of it. JR, what are your thoughts? Am I missing anything else here? You're on mute. Or maybe he's having audio challenges. You're still on mute.
All right.
Yeah, you're
Can you
back.
hear me okay now?
You're back.
All right, good. Yeah, I'll just pile on to what you said earlier, and that is, the partnership with other departments is critical here. Like, to use the pest control example, I'm having a relationship with the finance team, having a relationship with the physical security folks, and catching some of this stuff early on in the process, like during PO generation or during initial scheduling, and being able to go, is there something not right here? I've found that organizations that have good kind of deputized relationships with their security team, and they have security stakeholders buried within different parts of the organization, are so much more likely to catch that stuff than folks who have just been beaten over the head with traditional security training and awareness. If I go to finance and say, hey, I'd like to work with you on the process around POs, so when something comes in and someone's going to be on site, we know if that's a real actor or not, goes a very long way to preventing the early stage intelligence gathering that is associated with these type of social engineering attacks. Good partnerships across the business, very important, especially on the IT and software engineering, application development, DBA side. Those folks know things about their line of business that the security practitioner might not. And so having them know that if they see things that are out of the ordinary, let's go pull the security alarm and let the cybersecurity practitioners know something fishy is going on, no pun intended. Very powerful, especially again, left a boom in the kill chain early on in these attacks.
There's some discussion in the chat, which I want to address too, is absolutely, they have policies and standards that say, hey, someone must be following this vendor around, etc. And this is where the social engineering piece comes into play. We go on site, and sure, they have certain policies and standards, but you are building a rapport, building a relationship with that point of contact. They may be busy. The last thing they want to do is probably follow around pest control people who are looking at corners and walking around with a little flashlight all over the data center floor, and it seems kind of meaningless for that person to be around. And often in those cases, after a while, I don't know, they get a phone call, they walk away for a little bit, they may be understaffed, and they go, hey, I'm the only one at the front desk, I need to go look at some emails or answer some stuff. Or if you build strong enough of a relationship, sometimes you can be like, hey, don't waste your time here. If you need to go do something else, go do something else, we'll be fine. And many times people will walk away. So that's where the social engineering and the creativity comes into play on how to get someone off your back if they have policies and standards in place for that.
Great stuff. What else do we have for questions?
Well, we have a question from Dana, and JR, I'll ask this to you. Are you finding that board of directors are asking more detailed questions on a company's cyber program, specifically the basics, including pen testing?
Yeah, great question. And Dana, thanks for joining the call. Nice to see your name on the list of attendees. So definitely, if you look at the guidance that has been issued to boards by the National Association of Corporate Directors and subsequent guidance around board oversight, that guidance really is dictating that boards take a more active role in understanding what's happening in their cyber environment. And that includes, penetration testing. The risk-based view of the world, what are the bad guys doing and how would they get us? Penetration testing is a great way to answer a lot of that, right? How would the bad guys actually attempt an attack against me, and what techniques, tactics, procedures would they use? Boards are interested in this stuff. And I think the other thing too is it keeps it interesting. Boards are reading in the news about different attacks. They see, what's going on in the world. They're curious, does this stuff impact me? And so being able to clearly articulate, yes, we've, simulated that activity and here's what we found, goes a long way towards establishing really credibility with the board that we're paying attention to what the bad guys are doing, which is an important part of our job. So absolutely seeing a lot of more involvement in board and executive level discussions around penetration testing.
We had another question, which was around, highlighting the MGM incident recently, which is when we're doing social engineering attacks, are we also calling help desks and trying to see what we can do there? And Dana, yeah, thanks for the question again. That absolutely, that's something we do. It just depends on the scope of what our objectives are. The example I shared earlier was an on-site assessment of a data center. So we were not necessarily calling the help desk to see what we could do there, but we have incidents, and I have some funny stories there too, where, you often go through LinkedIn and figure out, who has a big team in the company, find out their name, and then figure out who one of their direct reports are. And once you do that off of LinkedIn, call in the help desk pretending like you need a password reset. And there are cases where all they need is a Slack message back or an IM message back from their manager saying, yes, go ahead and reset the password. And usually the help desk, in the name, they're trying to be very helpful to enable you to do what you need to do. And they'll message a manager who has, 200, 300 people that they manage. They don't know everyone. They don't know everyone's situation. And usually they'll just be like, yes, go ahead and unlock them. And we've done those type of engagements where we were able to call the help desk and reset passwords for various senior people in a company as well.
If you look at most of the attacks that have been wildly successful and very public in nature, really over the last 24 months, so many of them begin with either the phishing link or the phone call or the entry level quote social engineering test where you're just trying to get in the front door and establish a foothold. We certainly see that. We're constantly being barraged with smishing attempts and phishing attempts that pretend to be an executive at the company or an executive at one of our clients. So certainly when we have our partners at NetSPI do pen testing for us and for our clients, part of what we always want to do is the social engineering aspect of it to look for those weaknesses. And again, we're just looking for control failure. Are the controls that we have in place that say, no, you're not supposed to let just anybody in the front door, are they working as intended?
Well, Nabil, JR, thank you both so much. And thank you to everyone who has taken the time to join us for today's webinar. Remember, this session was recorded, so you will be receiving a copy of the recording very, very soon. But in the meantime, have a wonderful rest of your day, and we hope to see you again next time. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.